The Galactic University of Advanced Security stood as a beacon of knowledge and discipline, attracting the brightest minds from across the known universe. Its reputation for producing top-tier strategists, analysts, and law enforcers was unmatched, and the final year students faced one of the most rigorous challenges ever devised: the unbreakable prison assignment. This year, the challenge was overseen by Professor Exiloth, a towering insectoid being with 4 translucent wings folded neatly against his back and multifaceted eyes that reflected the light like polished gemstones. His voice, deep and layered, echoed across the amphitheater as he addressed the gathered students. Security is not about strength, it is about control, about ensuring that no one, no matter how intelligent, how resourceful, how desperate, can break through the defenses you construct. You will design a prison, a perfect prison, one that no being, no matter their skills, abilities, or knowledge, can escape from. Eddie Carter sat near the edge of the room, arms crossed, listening carefully. He was the only human in the class, and for the past 2 years he had grown accustomed to being underestimated. The other students, an array of alien species with superior physical strength, telepathic abilities, or biologically integrated technologies, saw him as an anomaly, an interesting but ultimately unimpressive participant in their academic endeavors. Professor Xylath continued, his mandibles clicking with every syllable. The challenge is simple in theory. You will each construct a prison of your own design, implementing the most sophisticated security measures you can devise. Once complete, your fellow students will be imprisoned within it, one at a time. Each prisoner will have a maximum of 24 hours to escape. If no one can break out of your prison, you pass. If someone escapes, you fail. Murmurs spread through the hall. The stakes were high. This is not just about academic excellence, Exlaith continued. Many of you will go on to design security systems for high-profile installations, perhaps even interstellar detention facilities. This is a test of real-world application. Eddie felt the eyes of his classmates shift toward him, some filled with curiosity, others with amusement. He could already sense what they were thinking. How could a human, a species from a relatively primitive planet, possibly succeed in a challenge where even highly advanced civilizations struggled? After the briefing, the students were given 3 weeks to design their prisons. The laboratory facilities were open to them, providing access to advanced energy field generators, molecular lock doors, and even neural inhibitors that could suppress a prisoner's ability to think clearly. The most competitive among them wasted no time, diving into their designs with relentless focus. Zin Kor, a reptilian student with iridescent green scales and elongated limbs, was particularly smug about his approach. He had developed a security system that constantly rearranged the layout of the prison, altering the doors, walls, and corridors in randomized patterns. Even if someone memorized the route to escape, the structure would shift, rendering that knowledge useless. "I'd like to see anyone try to break through this," Zinkor boasted during a discussion session. His forked tongue flickered as he grinned. Another student, Vexa, a tall, cyan-skinned humanoid with a natural affinity for electromagnetic control, had designed a prison that neutralized all physical movement by generating a gravitational field so intense that escaping required inhuman levels of strength. Each design was more sophisticated than the last, built upon layers of advanced technology, brute force, or psychological manipulation. Eddie, however, did not spend his time working with energy fields, reinforced alloys, or high-tech restraints. While others obsessed over making their prisons physically inescapable, he focused on something entirely different. Human ingenuity had never been about raw power. It was about understanding weaknesses. He spent his first week observing the designs of his classmates, listening to their discussions, analyzing the flaws in their approaches. He knew that every security system had a weakness, even the most advanced ones. Over-reliance on technology often led to predictability, and predictability was exploitable. When the deadline arrived, each student submitted their designs. The instructors reviewed the blueprints, ensuring they met the challenge's requirements. Eddie's submission drew a few raised eyebrows. His prison was simple. It had no shifting corridors, no neural inhibitors, no high-intensity gravity fields. It was just a single steel cell, reinforced with a heavy-duty locking mechanism. No sophisticated AI, no redundant security measures. Just 4 walls, a door, and a keycard lock. When his design was displayed on the central holographic projector, the entire class erupted into laughter. "You call that a prison?" Zincor sneered, barely able to contain his amusement. "That's not even worth testing." Vexa smirked. "Is this a joke, Carter? Because if it is, it's not a very good one." Even Professor Exilath looked unimpressed. "Explain your reasoning," he said. Eddie leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "Everyone here is relying on technology to create an inescapable environment. You assume that if the security system is complex enough, no one can outsmart it. But the more complicated a system is, the more weaknesses it has. My design is based on something far simpler: psychological manipulation." Zincor rolled his eyes. "Psychological manipulation? What nonsense is this?" Eddie continued, ignoring the skepticism in the room. "The greatest weakness of any prison is not the walls or the locks, it's the people who operate it. Every prison, no matter how advanced, is run by sentient beings. And sentient beings make mistakes." A silence settled over the room. Professor Exilath narrowed his eyes. "So you expect someone to escape your prison by tricking the guards?" Eddie nodded. "Exactly. Every security system is designed to keep someone in, but no one considers the human element, or in this case, the alien element. Even the best security officers grow careless, distracted, or overconfident. A good escape artist doesn't fight against the system, he exploits the flaws in the people running it." The professor didn't respond immediately, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "Interesting approach, but highly unorthodox. I guess we'll see how it holds up in the actual test," Eddie said with a shrug. And so, the challenge was set. Over the next few days, the students took turns being locked in different prisons, testing each other's designs. Some of the more advanced security systems proved completely impenetrable at first. But, as Eddie had expected, many students eventually found exploitable loopholes. The shifting prison designed by Zincor, for example, had a minor bug. After 6 hours, a slight pattern emerged in the randomization sequence, allowing a clever prisoner to predict the next shift. Vexa's high-gravity containment system malfunctioned when exposed to an electromagnetic surge, enabling an escape through an unguarded maintenance panel. Eddie watched every failure carefully. Finally, it was his turn to be imprisoned. His designated prison was Zincor's so-called impossible escape room, and he would have 24 hours to break out. The challenge was about to begin. Eddie sat in the cold, dimly lit cell, his back against the smooth metallic wall. The moment the heavy door sealed shut behind him, the sound of the electronic locks engaging filled the confined space. The air smelled sterile, devoid of any organic presence, a sign that the facility was maintained exclusively by automated systems. A faint hum resonated through the structure, likely from the energy grid that powered the security measures in place. Zincor had watched with satisfaction as the door closed, standing outside with arms crossed, his slit-like pupils narrowing in amusement. "You have 24 hours, he had said with a smirk before walking away. Eddie exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. There was no use rushing. Desperation led to mistakes, and mistakes got people caught. The first step was always observation. He scanned the room. The walls were perfectly smooth, a continuous surface with no visible panels, seams, or weak points. The ceiling had a single recessed lighting fixture, emitting a soft white glow, and a small ventilation grid barely the size of his fist. The floor was solid, likely reinforced to withstand any attempts at forceful escape. No furniture, no distractions, just an empty space meant to hold a prisoner indefinitely. The only way out was the door, a thick slab of reinforced metal. It had no visible handle or control panel from the inside. a seamless, unbroken surface with a biometric scanner mounted outside, completely inaccessible. Eddie approached the door, pressing his palm against the cool metal. The moment his skin made contact, a faint ripple of energy vibrated against his hand. The surface was magnetically sealed. No amount of brute force would move it. Even if he could somehow pry it open, the facility's AI-controlled defenses would respond instantly. He smiled. It was never about breaking the door. The real weakness wasn't in the walls, the locks, or the security system. It was in the people who ran it. The first step was understanding who was monitoring him. Eddie walked to the far corner of the room and sat down again, resting his head against the wall. He slowed his breathing, letting his eyes half close as if settling in for a long, exhausting wait. Then he listened. For the first 5 minutes, the room remained silent, aside from the distant hum of the facility's power grid. Then, faintly, through the ventilation shaft, he picked up a sound. Breathing. Someone was nearby. A living warden. It confirmed what he had suspected. If the security system were entirely automated, escape would have been far more difficult. Machines didn't make mistakes. AI didn't get distracted. But sentient beings? They were full of flaws. He shifted slightly, making sure to keep his movements slow, almost lethargic. He didn't want to appear alert. If someone was watching, they needed to see exactly what they expected, a human sitting in a cell, waiting for time to pass. Another sound. Footsteps. Soft, measured, moving at a steady pace. The steps didn't echo like metal against metal, suggesting the warden was walking on a padded surface just beyond the door. The rhythm was even, almost mechanical. Whoever it was, they had walked this corridor many times before. A creature of habit. That was useful. Eddie remained still for another few minutes, mapping out every detail his senses could gather. The footsteps passed his door, then stopped for a brief moment before continuing further down the hall. A patrol route, likely checking on other prisoners. The pattern repeated several times, confirming his theory. 15 minutes passed before he heard something new. A shift in breathing, a sigh. The warden was growing bored. Eddie suppressed a smirk. Good, that was the first weakness. Boredom led to carelessness. Now, it was time for the second step. Exploiting it. He let out a deep, shaky breath, adjusting his posture to appear restless. He ran a hand through his hair, letting his fingers tremble slightly. Then, with a deliberate exhale, he mumbled just loud enough for his voice to carry through the ventilation. No, 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 this isn't happening, this isn't happening. A pause, then a soft shuffle outside the door. He had the warden's attention. Good. He rocked slightly, pressing his palms against the sides of his head. I shouldn't be here, he muttered, letting his voice crack just enough to sound strained. This is a mistake. This is a mistake. Another shuffle. Eddie barely resisted the urge to smile. Hook set. Now, time to reel it in. His breathing quickened, becoming uneven. He made sure to keep his voice just below a whisper, forcing the listener to strain. I have to get out. I have to get out. Then, suddenly, he slammed his fists against the floor. The sound echoed through the small space, sharp and jarring. The warden outside the door froze. Eddie staggered to his feet, pressing his forehead against the cold metal. His voice wavered, desperate. You don't understand. I can't stay here. Please, you have to let me out. You don't... He took a ragged breath, letting the silence stretch before whispering, It's going to find me. That was the final push. A small beep sounded from outside the door. The warden was activating a comlink, speaking softly, just barely above a whisper. Prisoners exhibiting signs of distress. Perfect. Eddie immediately stilled, regulating his breathing. He needed to hear this. A low, static-laced voice responded. Symptoms: hyperventilation. Repeating phrases. Mild panic attack. A pause. possible psychological breakdown. The voice on the comm sighed. He's human. They react like this under pressure. Leave him. He'll calm down. Eddie's pulse quickened. No, that wasn't the response he wanted. He had to push further. He gripped his own arms, digging his nails into his skin, pacing the length of the room in erratic movements. He muttered incomprehensible phrases, making sure to let his voice break at the right moments. He took 3 steps toward the door, then stopped abruptly, snapping his head toward the corner of the cell as if he had seen something there. His breathing hitched, shoulders tensing. He took 1 slow step back, then another. Then, with sharp, barely contained terror, he whispered, "No, it's already here." Silence. A full 30 seconds of silence. Then a beep, the sound of the security lock disengaging. Eddie kept his back to the door, keeping his body tense. The footsteps behind him were cautious, hesitant, exactly what he needed. He inhaled slowly, his heartbeat steady. He had 1 chance. The moment the warden stepped inside, it would be over. Eddie let out a shuddering breath and waited for the right moment to strike. The moment the door slid open, Eddie remained still. His breathing was uneven, his shoulders tense, his entire posture designed to radiate fear. He could hear the measured footsteps behind him, slow and cautious as the warden stepped inside. The scent of damp stone mixed with the sterile air of the facility, a faint trace of something organic that confirmed what he had suspected. The warden was not just a machine. He was alive. Eddie did not turn to face him. He let his body tremble just slightly, his fingers twitching at his sides as if he were barely holding himself together. It was all about controlling perception. The warden had seen prisoners break before, had dealt with them long enough to know that when fear took hold, reasoning collapsed. And when reasoning collapsed, mistakes were made. The warden took another step forward. The door remained open behind him, but Eddie knew it was temporary. The second the warden decided there was no real threat, he would step back and reseal the cell. That couldn't happen. Eddie inhaled sharply, his head snapping toward the far corner of the room as if he had just seen something move in the shadows. His breath caught in his throat, his pupils dilating as he stumbled back. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice trembling. His back hit the cold metal of the doorframe, and for the first time he turned slightly, allowing himself to catch a glimpse of the warden's face. The warden was an amphibian, his green, scaled skin reflecting the artificial light of the room. His black, lidless eyes narrowed in frustration, his muscular frame poised for a reaction. He was larger than Eddie, stronger, and fully armored in the standard security uniform of the Galactic University. The stun baton strapped to his belt pulsed with an inactive energy charge, and his clawed fingers rested near it in case he needed to act. He was analyzing the situation, determining whether Eddie was a threat or simply another weak-willed human losing his grip. That brief hesitation was all Eddie needed. His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's right behind you." The warden's breath hitched. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but Eddie caught it. He had seen enough creatures react to fear to know that even the smallest doubt could crack an unbreakable mind. The warden turned his head slightly, just for a fraction of a second. That was his mistake. Eddie lunged. His body moved with practiced precision, his years of hand-to-hand combat training kicking in as he twisted forward, slamming his palm against the warden's chest. The amphibian staggered back, his balance momentarily thrown off. Before he could react, Eddie's fingers were already wrapping around the baton at his belt, yanking it free with a sharp twist. The warden hissed in frustration, his hands reaching for Eddie, but it was too late. Eddie activated the baton with a single press of his thumb, the energy core surging to life with a crackling pulse. He didn't hesitate. He drove the weapon into the warden's side, the electric charge sending a violent jolt through his body. The amphibian convulsed, his limbs locking up as his muscles seized from the current. Eddie caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him with careful control to avoid drawing attention. The entire confrontation had lasted 3 seconds. He took a deep breath, adrenaline humming through his veins as he quickly scanned the unconscious form at his feet. The warden's uniform had multiple security layers, but Eddie was only interested in one thing: the access card attached to his belt. He ripped it free, flipping it over in his hands to check for biometric locks. No fingerprints required. Perfect. He pressed the card against the panel by the door, and a soft beep confirmed the authorization. The door remained open. Eddie knew he had no more than 5 minutes before someone noticed the warden had stopped transmitting his patrol updates. He needed to move. Stepping over the unconscious form, Eddie crept into the hallway, his senses heightened. The corridor stretched in both directions, dimly illuminated by blue emergency lighting along the walls. He kept his footsteps silent, relying on muscle memory and training to minimize sound. The entire prison was designed to be inescapable, but he knew something no one else did. It wasn't about breaking out, it was about walking out. He didn't need to force his way past energy barriers or brute force the security locks. He needed to blend in. And for that, he needed a disguise. His eyes flicked back to the unconscious warden. It would take too long to strip him of his uniform, and the size difference was too noticeable. Instead, Eddie focused on the simplest method of deception: confidence. He slung the baton onto his own belt and adjusted his posture. A prisoner moved cautiously, hesitantly. A guard moved with authority. If he carried himself like someone who belonged, people wouldn't question him. He turned right, heading down the corridor with a measured pace. The facility's design was sleek, cold, and geometric. Every hallway identical, meant to disorient prisoners. But Eddie had already memorized the patrol routes. The control room was 3 levels above him. If he could access it, he could override the security logs and erase his escape attempt before anyone noticed. A door ahead slid open. Eddie didn't break stride. A second warden stepped into view, an avian species with sharp, golden feathers lining his arms. His black uniform was identical to the amphibians, and his talon-like fingers flexed absently as he walked. Eddie kept his expression neutral, his eyes forward. Guards don't acknowledge each other unless necessary. The avian warden glanced at him, his golden eyes flickering with mild curiosity, but he didn't stop. He continued past without a word. Eddie exhaled slowly, suppressing the tension in his muscles. The disguise was working, for now. He reached the nearest elevator panel and swiped the stolen access card. The screen blinked red. Restricted access. Eddie clenched his jaw. Of course. The warden's clearance wasn't high enough. He needed another plan. Looking up, he noticed a maintenance hatch embedded in the ceiling near the elevator shaft. It was small, barely large enough for a human body to squeeze through, but it would lead into the ventilation system. If he could crawl through undetected, he might bypass the security checkpoints altogether. Glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was watching, Eddie reached up, gripping the panel's edge. He braced his weight against the wall and pulled himself up with practiced ease. The metal groaned softly under his weight, but he managed to slide inside before the noise could draw attention. The tunnel was tight, forcing him to move on his elbows and knees. The scent of old metal and recycled air filled his nostrils, the low hum of the ventilation system vibrating through his body. He crawled forward, counting each turn, each intersection. Then he saw it, a security station just below him. Through the grate, he spotted 3 guards monitoring holographic screens. They were discussing routine patrol schedules, oblivious to his presence above them. But Eddie's attention was on something else. The emergency override terminal in the corner. That was his way out. His heart pounded as he prepared his next move. One mistake, one noise, and everything would be over. But if he pulled this off, he wouldn't just escape. He would erase his existence from the system entirely. Eddie steadied his breath as he peered through the narrow grate in the ventilation shaft. Below him, 3 guards sat at a semicircular control station, their holographic monitors flickering with security feeds, biometric scans, and data logs. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of the screens, casting elongated shadows across the smooth metallic walls. The hum of machinery filled the air, masking the faint sound of his own breathing. He didn't have much time. His gaze shifted toward the emergency override terminal tucked away in the corner of the room. It was a compact station, smaller than the main security consoles, yet infinitely more valuable. If he could access it, he could erase his presence from the prison system. His entry logs, cell designation, biometric profile, everything. Once the system no longer recognized him as a prisoner, he wouldn't have to fight his way out. He would simply walk out. But getting to the terminal wouldn't be easy. The 3 guards were alert, their eyes flicking between the monitors, scanning for anomalies. One was a towering reptilian with thick, overlapping scales covering his arms, his clawed fingers tapping idly against the desk. The second was insectoid, his compound eyes reflecting the holographic glow, his antennae twitching as he processed incoming data. The third was humanoid, his uniform perfectly pressed, his posture rigid with military discipline. He looked like the one in charge. Eddie needed a distraction. His mind raced through possibilities. He had no weapons, no tools, and no backup. A direct confrontation was out of the question. He was fast, but not fast enough to take down 3 trained guards before one of them could sound the alarm. He needed to use their own security systems against them. He carefully adjusted his position, reaching for the stolen access card tucked into his sleeve. If the warden he had subdued was carrying this level of clearance, it meant he had basic access to certain systems. Not enough to unlock high-security doors, but enough to trigger minor facility functions. Holding the card against the scanner built into his wrist communicator, he activated the interface. A small menu appeared: patrol route updates, camera calibration, automated alerts. That was all he needed. His fingers moved quickly, selecting camera calibration. A sub-menu appeared: deactivate for maintenance, manual reboot sequence. That would work. He selected manual reboot sequence and set the target location to the west corridor, a sector far from his current position. The moment he executed the command, a soft chime echoed from the security consoles below. The humanoid guard glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. Rebooting cameras in Sector 7? The insectoid's antennae twitched. Odd timing. Was there a request? The reptilian exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. Could be a glitch. The system updates have been unstable since last week. The humanoid didn't look convinced. He tapped the console, pulling up the maintenance logs. I don't like unexplained activity. I'll send a unit to check it out. Eddie's stomach tensed. That wasn't the response he wanted. He needed something bigger. His fingers moved swiftly over the interface again, activating automated alerts. This time he selected unauthorized access detected, security breach, engineering wing. Then he set a 1-minute delay before execution. If he did this right, the guards wouldn't just be suspicious. They would be forced to leave. A minute later, the security room's alarms blared to life. The sound was sharp and piercing, flashing red warnings across the monitors. The insectoid guard's posture stiffened. Unauthorized access detected in engineering. The humanoid's expression hardened. Who authorized that alert? No one. It's an automated trigger. The reptilian was already on his feet, grabbing a pulse rifle from the weapon rack. Engineering is 2 levels down. We need to move. Eddie held his breath as the humanoid hesitated. If he stayed, everything would fall apart. Then the decision was made. Let's go, the humanoid snapped. Lock down this room before we leave. The 3 of them moved swiftly, exiting through the secured blast door. The moment it sealed behind them, Eddie pushed the vent panel open and dropped down into the room. He landed silently, rolling onto his feet, his body tense with adrenaline. He rushed toward the emergency override terminal, his fingers flying across the interface. The system demanded an access code, but Eddie was already prepared. He pulled up the warden's stolen card, overriding the security protocol. The screen flickered, then displayed. Identity purge initiated. One by one, his prisoner records disappeared. His cell assignment gone. His biometric profile erased. His name vanished from the database. He exhaled sharply. It worked. Now, as far as the system was concerned, he had never been here. Eddie straightened, stepping away from the terminal. His heart pounded as he turned toward the door. The real test was walking out. He approached the control panel beside the door, swiped the stolen access card. Access granted. The door slid open without hesitation. Eddie stepped into the corridor, his expression neutral, his posture controlled. He didn't run, he didn't hesitate, he walked with purpose, just like any other officer in the facility. The security wing was busy. Guards moved in coordinated patrols, officers discussed orders, the facility remained in motion. No one gave him a second glance. He wasn't escaping anymore. He was leaving. Eddie walked through the security wing with the calmness of someone who belonged there. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. He kept his posture straight, his hands relaxed, and his eyes forward. The uniformed guards around him were too focused on their own assignments to pay him any attention. That was the beauty of routine. When people saw what they expected to see, they questioned nothing. He had spent enough time studying their behavior to know that confidence was the key to walking past them unnoticed. The corridors stretched ahead in an intricate maze of metallic walls and glowing interface panels. The facility was vast, designed with efficiency rather than comfort in mind. The walls pulsed faintly with embedded energy circuits, feeding power to the high-security systems that protected every entrance and exit. Despite the complexity of the structure, Eddie had already memorized the most critical aspect, the fastest way out. Ahead, 2 guards stood by an intersection, their weapons holstered but within easy reach. Eddie resisted the urge to slow down. Hesitation would be suspicious. He gave them a short nod as he passed. One of them, a broad-shouldered humanoid with cybernetic implants along his jawline, glanced in his direction but said nothing. The other, a shorter figure with the crest of an avian species, barely acknowledged him. That was exactly what Eddie wanted. He reached an access checkpoint. A thick, reinforced door blocked the way, with a biometric scanner positioned to the side. Beyond it lay the main transit hub, where personnel transports arrived and departed in scheduled intervals. He needed to be on one of those transports before anyone realized what had happened. Eddie approached the scanner and retrieved the stolen access card. The device emitted a soft chime, and for a moment he thought it had worked, but then the screen flashed red. Restricted access. Clearance levels assumed a restriction. His pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. Turning slightly, he shifted his stance to block the screen from view in case anyone was watching. This was a problem. The warden's clearance wasn't high enough for external access. He had bypassed internal security, but leaving the facility required a higher level of authority. Options raced through his mind. He could try hacking the terminal, but that would take too long and might trigger an alarm. He could attempt to override the system using a secondary panel, but that would require tools he didn't have. That left one final option: stealing an officer's credentials. He took a slow breath and scanned the corridor. The guards stationed nearby weren't high-ranking enough to have the clearance he needed. He needed someone important. Someone with access to the external gates. Then he saw him. A senior officer, clad in an upgraded version of the standard uniform, was walking toward the checkpoint. The insignia on his chest marked him as a sector commander, the highest level of security personnel stationed inside the facility. His clearance would be enough to get through any door. Eddie knew what he had to do. He turned and began walking toward the officer as if he had a purpose. He needed to act fast. Every second he hesitated was a second closer to discovery. As he neared, he subtly adjusted his posture, adopting the rigid stance of a subordinate. When the officer was within range, Eddie spoke in a firm, measured tone. "Commander, we need you at Sector 9. There's been an anomaly flagged in the system logs. I was ordered to escort you." The officer barely glanced at him, his expression irritated but uninterested. What kind of anomaly? Eddie kept his face unreadable. Unauthorized biometric access flagged in the restricted archives. They requested your immediate clearance to verify logs. The officer sighed, already moving toward the nearest security console. They always overreact. What's your designation? Eddie responded without hesitation. Logistics officer, assigned to data analysis. The officer scanned his own card against a nearby console, pulling up security logs. His attention was split. That was Eddie's moment. Moving with precise speed, Eddie reached for the officer's card the instant it was removed from the scanner. His fingers closed around it in a swift motion, and before the officer even realized what had happened, Eddie pivoted away, slipping the card into his sleeve. "Let's go," Eddie said smoothly, giving the officer no time to react. They walked back toward the checkpoint, the officer following without a second thought. He was already reaching for his access card, the one Eddie had just stolen. His hand patted at his uniform, then again. He stopped, his brow furrowed. Eddie kept walking, reaching the checkpoint first. He swiped the stolen card against the scanner. The screen blinked green. Access granted. The reinforced doors slid open, revealing the main transit hub. Eddie stepped through without breaking pace. He was inside. Behind him, the officer was patting down his uniform, confusion turning to frustration. It would take him another 5 seconds to realize his card was missing. Another 10 seconds to sound an alert. Eddie only needed 3. His eyes locked onto the nearest transport ship, a sleek personnel carrier preparing for departure. The boarding ramp was still open, crew members checking last-minute cargo shipments. No one paid him any attention. He moved toward the ship, stepping into the line of departing personnel. A security officer at the entrance was scanning credentials. Eddie kept his movements smooth as he pulled out the stolen card and presented it. The officer barely looked at him before scanning the card. The device beeped. Clearance confirmed. Eddie walked up the ramp and into the ship. The instant he was inside, he moved toward the back, taking a seat near the emergency exits. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the weight of every decision pressing against him. He didn't exhale until the engines rumbled, the vibrations traveling through the floor. Outside, the alarm had gone off. He could see guards rushing toward the checkpoint. The officer he had stolen the card from was yelling orders, pointing toward the transit hub. It didn't matter anymore. The boarding ramp retracted, the doors sealed shut. The ship lifted off. Eddie leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He had done it. He wasn't escaping anymore. He was gone.